Welcome, this is the orientation to the Unreal 5.1 VR Blueprints Only template with multiplayer. So you've just downloaded the version for the Epic Launcher. If you have downloaded a version for the source build, that's great. Wherever you extracted it to, you can just open it up by clicking on that U project, or you can open up your launcher, go to Library, Launch, Unreal 5.1. All right, navigate to wherever you extracted that project and open it up like so. Okay, we open onto a blank map. This is on purpose, don't panic. It's so that if your graphics screw up, you can load the template easily again. Okay, so let's go to the content browser, find our new VR template, and first thing I want to talk about is the framework. The most important part of the framework is the game mode. Basically, the game mode handles when new players join, it grabs their player controller, it spawns them a pawn to use, and it possesses that pawn for them. That's it. That's all you got to know about that. The player controller itself has some role in the setup of the pawn, and optionally, it can store some of the pawn settings that I don't have enabled at the moment, but in theory, it can send some of the settings to the instance, the game instance, which is another framework blueprint that saves between map changes so that your player doesn't have to recalibrate between maps. These other ones exist, but they're not that important. You'll notice I have a custom things folder. This has all of the things that are not really blueprints themselves, but that help the blueprints. For example, interfaces, enumerators, structs that I use for the other blueprints. Without further ado, let's dive into the pawn. So we've got the viewport open for this pawn so that you can see the different subcomponents that make it up. If you look over here in the components panel, you can see how they're attached and all that. Let's dive into the event graph. Double click that. And basically, on this page, we just have this tick. And the idea is that this gives you a broad overview of which functions are being called in what order every single frame. I've made a note here that startup is on a separate page. Indeed it is, so we can click down here. What you need to know about startup is not that much. If you go and you screw with it, just make sure that you preserve whatever order things are happening in, or if you need to add something to it, think about the order that things are happening, and the sequencing does matter here. Also, keep in mind I have some of these nodes here I call network switcher. It's a little bit more advanced version of the has authority switch that lets you switch between different kinds of network ownership. Basically, this is because I created this with listen servers in mind, and anytime you have a listen server, that is a client is acting as a server, stuff gets complicated. So you want a little bit more fine control, more than just whether or not it has authority. Okay, so this is where you'll find all the stuff that happens at the beginning, and quite a bit of it is actually on the VR menu. Now the VR menu page is split into two sections. One is the menu itself. I'm not happy with this. This is the little menu that pops up on your left controller when you start the game or anytime you press the left thumbstick. My intention is to create a totally new blueprint for this, and it'll be its own actor. The way I have it set up, it is very difficult to modify. And then in here, it's other sort of setup stuff that has to do with the pawn's relation to real life. So this is where it's tracking where the floor is in real space. It's when you calibrate where the floor is and where the player's height is, this is where all of that's happening. So this is probably the most complicated stuff that is in this template. and I don't recommend screwing with it too hard, or if you do, make sure you save what you had. Okay, so we're going to hop back to the event graph. We're going to look at what happens on tick. So the first thing that happens is we're updating the floor. So this is what I just talked about. This is on the VR menu page, and the pawn keeps track of where the real life floor is relative to the camera, and it uses this for a number of things. Moving back, okay. Inputs page. All right, so before anything else, we move the floor. Next is that we receive control inputs. This is on the inputs page here. Okay, I don't have that much here, and I have a note here explaining that I have not done this in really the best possible way. So I'll go over what you see here, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I wish I had done it and how I'll probably do it going forward. It's not that big a deal right now because there's not that many controls, but as it gets bigger, you'll want to follow this advice, which follows. We have a couple sets. One are what I'm calling interrupts, so just anytime you press a button or something and it triggers an action, and the other ones are tick inputs, which we're polling the value of whichever tick. I recommend grabbing these, saving them to a variable, and then not doing anything like this here, where I'm going straight to an event or something out of that. Much better is to do something like here, where we're saying, okay, is this button being pressed? All right, if the button is being pressed, then let's do this. I think it's better to separate out the control inputs and then checking what they mean in combination with each other and checking them against the pawn state, and then saying, okay, given all of that, what actions should we trigger? I haven't done that here. You see I've got all this garbage here. This is not really the best way to do it. But going forward, think, okay, this is the page for capturing inputs, either from interrupts or from polling. And then you'll want to parse them and say, okay, do I have any other inputs that are relevant to this input? Is the state that I'm currently in valid for, one of the potential outputs for this function? And some of them should just be on other pages, but this is, if you can't think of another page to put it on, this is where you should generally parse inputs. We have a lot of inputs that are being parsed on the hands page that I'll get to in a bit. Anyway, going back to the tick. So we've got these two, receive control inputs, parse control inputs, and then hands. This is a big one. Okay, I'm going to zoom out so you can see the breadth of this. And then I'll just quickly go through these. And as I go through stuff, I'm going through it quickly, not because I think you should be able to absorb all that information so quickly, but because I want you to be aware that certain functions exist and whereabouts you can find them. And then you can dive in and figure out how they work, or if not, you can always come ask questions in the Discord. I'm always there, always pretty responsive. I don't think I've ever told anyone to wait more than a day or two, unless I had something going on in my life. So the first thing we'll look at here is access info by hand. This is going to take your grip and your trigger inputs. Now, certain hardware does grip and trigger inputs differently. Most of them use both as an axis. That is to say, it smoothly moves between 0 and 1 as you press or release the button. However, some of them are either on or off, like a regular button. They're not like a trigger or a grip in the sense that we're used to. So I think like the Vive grip is what I call binary. I think some things have binary triggers where it doesn't tell you exactly where the trigger is. It either tells you if it's on or off. Okay, so if that's the case, set these variables as necessary, and then this is where it will translate that binary trigger into a float for you, because we use it like a float in the rest of it. The other thing that happens here is we have a grip damper. I made this because I was testing it on the Valve Index with the Knuckles controllers, and the grip is really sensitive, and I don't want the grip activated all the time. I want the grip only activated when I'm intentionally squeezing the grip. So I made a damper for it. Now you can actually go into like the Steam VR settings and do this without going into the game to do it. However, I didn't feel like it, so I did that here. In a perfect world, you would have all of this, not all of this, you would have the parts where it determines whether or not it's binary, whether or not it's a binary trigger, binary grip, and whether or not to damp the grip input. Back in the startup, you would have it detect the hardware being used and then select the best options for that. As it is, I don't have it doing that right now. It shouldn't be that hard for you to do for your target software. Okay, moving right along. We have animation updates based on the grip and the trigger. We send updates to the skeletal mesh of the hands. I will show you what that blend space looks like. This is when you want to change the how the way the animations work. Blend space is the place to look. Basically, each of these dots on this graph represents a different pose, and so you hold control on this graph and move your mouse around, and it'll show you based on a trigger value and the grip value. It blends between the different poses, so you can move these around. You can add new poses. You can change the values for them, whatever. Keep in mind, this is totally separate from like triggering a function. So for instance, if you're holding an item and you press the trigger, I think that looks like what? Like this? Yeah. So if you see this happening, that's not necessarily going to actually trigger the thing on the item. This is just the animation. Now, the sending the trigger command to the item is also based on this, and I'll get to that now actually. So we take the inputs from your grip and your trigger, and we've basically got four combinations. Either you're not pressing either of them, pressing only the trigger, only the grip, or you're pressing both. And I take your combined input, and this is from here on out, with the exception of animations, I only care which of these quadrants your pose is. And what that does is bloop, bloop, go through here, say, okay, what state is the hand in? Here are the different things the hand can be doing. Nothing, waiting, which is something I did like when it's switching between things, climbing, holding, or buttoning, which means you're trying to press a button. So if you're doing nothing, meaning your hand is idle, the different inputs that you can get are flat, meaning I'm not pressing either button. So what it does is it tests for items. So it shoots out a little sphere trace or something, and it looks for items, and it'll highlight them. If it finds any, it'll try to talk to them. Now, if you're already holding an item, meaning you're holding, so we go down here. Well, if you are flat, there are some instances where having flat will mean the item is dropped, some instances where it won't. If you're pressing the trigger while you're holding the item, it'll try to trigger whatever the item is. If you're press the grip button, it'll depend on the item. We'll get to how the items are set up later. But the point is, it comes through here, it looks at your current state, and then it looks at your grip and trigger input, your combined grip and trigger input. And then it'll either switch you to a new state or fire a function or send a function to an item, something like that. That's where all of this lives. We have hand collision and physics. I'll go to the easy ones first. The partial hand rotation just means that your hand stays exactly where it is when you're climbing, but it rotates slightly. It doesn't rotate. It rotates like a quarter of the way to wherever you've rotated your hand. So it just looks a little bit more natural when you're climbing. Your hand is not flying all over the place. When you're holding an item, the collision is actually controlled by some settings on the item. So you can have it so that the item does not collide, or that the item collides, or only your hand collides, or nothing collides, or whatever. There are different valid ways to do that. Most of the time, however, it's going to do these things where we're going to have some amount of collision, some amount of trying to match the rotation, even through a collision. And this is where if you push against a wall and you're floating, you'll fly away in accordance with Newton's laws. That's here. And then additionally, I've disconnected this for now, but this is where in accordance with Newton's laws, not just you fly away, but the object should fly away too, depending. I want to redo this system, so I've disconnected it for now. And at the time I was thinking I would have different physics systems, either using the built-in physics system or using what I call like a fake physics system, so that I can have a little bit more fine-tuned control over it. So for instance, sometimes you will want items to affect the pawn, but you don't want the pawn to affect the item, or vice versa, where you you want to be able to push the item, but it shouldn't push the pawn or whatever. And all this junk tries to figure out, okay, well, which kind of physics should I use? And then given where my hand is, how fast I'm moving, how I'm moving my hand, how should I move, and then how should the item move, which again is disconnected at the moment. Okay, try button is down here. Basically, it just sends a message to the button that tells it where your finger is, and then the button does the rest from there. There is some replication stuff here that I'm going to skip over right now, but just the basics of the button is I'm looking for a button. If I find one, I tell it where my finger is, and then the button says, okay, I should move here. This needs some work. This is ghost hand penetration visuals. What that means is if you put your hand through a wall, your hand will be blocked by that wall. However, I will still allow you to see where your motion controller is. So you'll notice over here that we have ghost hands and we have solid hands. The solid hands are the ones that are always visible and they actually collide with things. The ghost hands are the ones that just stay connected to your motion controller. And most of the time they're invisible, but if you try to push through a wall or something, the portion that is through the wall will become visible so that you don't get confused. It's really easy to lose track of whether something is trying to tell you that's where your actual hand is or that's just where it is in game. So I let you see both. I think that's good for players. So hand actions, I mentioned that depending on your state and the inputs to the hand, it may trigger certain actions. So this is where we try climbing. It looks for whichever things you can climb. And then all the climbing logic is down here. I think it has some stuff so that if you grab with a second hand, it automatically detaches the first hand or something. This is all the climbing stuff. Vaulting, meaning you push yourself away from the thing, or you push yourself up and over. A lot of times you'll see weird things, weird little functions that I've made that look like this, and they're not very well documented, and the variables aren't especially expressive. Couple thoughts on this. One, these either work so well that you shouldn't need to screw with them, or two, they are just crazy insanity that I created by trial and error, totally overfitted to a particular test case that you'll want to completely rewrite. So that's why I haven't gone in and put too much effort into that. I apologize for not being good at stuff. All right, moving over. So we talked about hand actions interacting with things based upon your state and input. Over here, item actions, if you happen to be holding an item, hand is holding, and then you press a thing, and then the item tells you, hey, yeah, that's a valid item for me. So the first one is just item search, which happens if you're not holding something and your hand doesn't otherwise have any inputs to it. Your hand will look for items that are near it, and then it'll highlight them. And then it'll tell your hand, hey, if you press this button, you can grab me, or whatever. And this is what happens when they're picked up or dropped. This is just some communication between, I don't know why these are so screwed up. I'm sorry about that, but it's not really important. Okay, this is hand movement from earlier where I told you if you're holding an item, then the item will determine what kind of collision you get. I guess I just did hand only. You'll have to implement other kinds of collision if you want to, but this is where your hand and item collision when holding an item are triggered from. This is a little bit special. Yeah, find a fast way to do this. Whatever kind of math I did here is probably not very clever, so we're going to scroll up and not look at it. But certain items have what I call a foregrip and a rear grip, and this means that you've got two hands on the item, and it has some special rules for being for how to orient itself based upon your two hands. And if I remember correctly, the foregrip will let you point. So, for instance, you're holding a rifle, right? So your foregrip will help you point in whatever direction you're between your rear grip and your foregrip, and your rear grip will let you control the roll of the weapon. And I think it's good. You the first time you try it, you might be a little bit confused, but I think you'll find that it actually makes a lot of sense. This doesn't currently do anything, but it should. What this is a prox check. There's an option on certain items to check to see whether or not your hand is still in proximity to it, and then if it is not, then it should automatically disconnect. I don't know why I forgot to do that. I apologize. Do we go over our hands? Yes, that is hands. Moving back to the event graph, what happens next? Movement sequences. Click, click. Okay, so we're on the body and collision page. I'm going to zoom out and let you know that this is a little bit complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on. However, as compared to previous versions, I think I've done a better job on this one, making it easy to modify a particular thing and to just you can disconnect certain things and it won't screw up everything else. Let's go through this. The first thing I want to talk about is this, probably the best comment that I've made in here, where it talks about the different scene components that make up the pawn's body and how we use them. Now, I mentioned in here that some of them are like somewhat redundant, and technically you should be able to derive the location of one from another, so that you shouldn't really need this many. However, that gets complicated real fast. It's hard as the dev to keep it in your head. So a lot of what happens on this page is the location for these scene components being automatically updated, so that when you need to grab a location, you don't have to think, okay, where is this in relation to the origin? And now is that the offset origin, or is that the hardware, or like whatever? Just know, okay, this is the top of the head, or this is where the camera actually is. Now your legs and your floor, well, those are below the body, right? They're just different different distances below the body. Well, under very weird circumstances, sometimes they're not directly under each other, and sometimes you don't want to do the extra math. I do the math for you, and you say, okay, I just want to know where the legs are. I just want to know where the floor is. Take a minute to look at this. And the important thing is here, your root box and your VR origin offset box. If we look up here, your root box is the root of the actor. If you do a node that says move actor, or it does something to the actor, or you do something to the root box, they are equivalent. The root box is basically your actor. The VR origin is not. What the VR origin does is it lets you offset from the actor, and it lets you rotate separately from it. I forget why this is important. However, it was necessary for me to do. And the way that we use it is whenever we're sitting down on something, or if we're on a surface that's moving, the way we accomplish that is by attaching the root box to it. And if we need to rotate in some way, we leave the root box the heck alone, and it's the origin that moves, or the origin that rotates, so that the pawn feels like it's in the correct orientation and it's offset correctly from the root box. For instance, if you calibrate your height and such. So we don't harass the your machine's idea of where your origin is. They all work differently, despite OpenXR being a common standard. I don't want to worry about how many different kinds of hardware there are that all, figure that out differently. Let's just do it once in here, and we'll just have one extra scene component, and it'll work on all the different kinds of hardware. Okay. I hope that was useful and not as boring as it sounded in my head. So movement sequences. So we just make sure that we're actually all your setup stuff is complete, or else this stuff is not going to work good. And the two sequences that we have are just walking and floating. sitting and climbing don't actually require their own sequences on this page because climbing is completely handled from the hands, and sitting, you're not moving. Once you attach to something, you're seated and you're done. You don't need a sequence for it. So let's talk about the walking sequence. And what that's going to do is it's going to take us to a different page, I think. Yeah, so walking is on its own page. A thing I decided to do here is anything having to do with collision of the body or updates for body parts locations, I put on one page. This is because it was getting hard to track how they work differently from one to the other, and this sort of encouraged me to use the same ones, like whenever possible, reuse functions for both floating and walking, or I can put them next to each other and say, okay, I think one of these is for walking and one of them's for floating. What's the difference here? Why are they different? And then you can come in and see the differences easily instead of jumping between pages. So anyway, the actual movement itself that it happens from you starts on tick. And the first thing we do is these things, which are on other pages. So update neck, body, legs, which is on body and collision. These are just updates to body part locations like I talked about earlier. This helps get you set up for everything else. And then move floor, which is on that VR menu in the setup page. Move the floor to wherever we think it really is. Okay, that's just a prerequisite for continuing to walk. So the next thing we do is it's going to look at the floor, say, can we walk here? Is there anything we need to know about the floor? Like, is the terrain too sloped? If it is sloped, do we want to follow the floor normal? Which means that, so for instance, in 0G, I think you mostly want to follow the floor normal if it's not too different, meaning the direction the floor is pointing. So if you look in the demo, you can see me sort of walking on the walls in some parts of the space station, because in 0G, right, like a wall is a floor, depending on how you're oriented. And this just keeps you oriented to it. So for example, if you're walking on a curved floor, it'll continuously rotate your pawn so that you follow it. You don't typically want this in gravity. So this doesn't happen in gravity. Your pawn follows the terrain, but you stay upright relative to the floor. We've got a couple things here. Walking cam too high. So what this does is it says, is your camera too far away from the floor compared to where we calibrated it was when you stand up straight? And if it is, maybe you're trying to jump, and it'll figure out if you're trying to jump. If we have stand to jump enabled, I recommend trying this out. I'm going to keep it enabled by default so that you don't press a button to jump. You literally jump in meat space. And it takes into account how fast your pawn was moving, how fast you physically jump. If you swing your arms forward, it'll take that all into account, and it'll give you an extra boost to go against gravity and such. It might want some fine tuning, but I think it works pretty well and it feels very natural. Now, if you don't like it, you can turn off stand to jump, and then there's a jump button that'll just give you a push you up. Now, if you're not jumping, I forget how it figures it out, but it figures out, hey, actually you're not jumping. We're just going to reset your height. You did something wrong during the calibration time. Oh, right. So for example, if you were seated when you did your calibration, then you stand up, it'll try to make you jump, and then it'll say, wait a second, no one can jump for that long. Why is your head so high? I'm going to just change your height calibration settings. Boop. This cancels that if the cam is not too far up. If we're allowed to do locomotion, this is just your 360 locomotion. Really simple. Going back, some other things that it does. That's here, isn't it? Vertical for terrain, so if you're going over terrain, it goes over smoothly instead of making you sick. Edge detector. Where does this actually get called from? So this was again walking tick, walk test. So if it traces down and it finds that there is no floor there, it says, wait a second, what's going on? And basically it detects the edge, the cliff, and it won't let you go over a cliff if you have this enabled. There's a way to disable it somehow. Anyway, it pushes you back. And this works both with 360 locomotion and with room scale movement. If you want to jump over a cliff, you can actually just jump, and then you'll go. I think somewhere I had an option to, if I had sprinting enabled, like I don't think sprinting is a thing. Yeah, so I don't have any buttons that actually make you sprint. But I would recommend, if you are annoyed by this edge thing, either disabling it or make it so if you have a sprint button, when you're holding on the sprint button, it just cancels edge detection. You just run right off the edge. Or just enjoy jumping off the edges and enjoy not falling off. The reason for this is because a lot of times in room scale, like you'll want to look over an edge, and then the way that room scale interprets your head being over the edge is that you've walked over the edge, right? So we don't want that to happen. We want you to be able to look over without falling off. And so it'll let you lean a little bit over it, but push you back. Just like I have some leaning functionality in the body and collision page. We'll get back to that. Let's talk about the float sequence, which is pretty simple. Is that really? It must, yeah, okay. So if you're allowed to clamp, meaning if you're not restricted to just ballistic movement, and I don't know why you would be. I think most of the time you're going to want to let your players walk on the floor if they're in 0G. This is where it says, okay, I'm floating, but is there a floor beneath me? And then if there is, check if the floor normal is okay. So like you can't attach to a floor that's totally perpendicular to your up vector. And then you attach to it blah, 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 update, and you switch to walking. Now if there's no floor, we just do our regular physics, and it'll just keep moving you where you need to go in accordance with your physics velocity and your gravity. And this, remember, can get updated from the hands. Like if you push on a wall, it'll update your physics velocity. And if you happen to be floating, it'll push you away next time. We call float pond physics. All right, moving back to body and collision, let's talk about the various collision types. Okay, so we've got some more body stuff. We talked about how the body part updates are here. Descriptions for how the body parts are used are here. Some things that don't work very well are in here. When the pawn rotates, that's the thing that does it. I need to write a different function for this. This is terrible. Gravity changes, for instance, when you teleport from the station to the moon. The teleportation itself has an issue with rotation at the end, which is broken. This is anytime your movement type changes, some things get triggered. Blah, blah, blah. This is like teleportation movement is terrible. Go ahead and change it however you want. You can attach yourself and sit down to a thing, sit down on a thing. I've been meaning to do an automatic stand up or sit down just by your, based off your camera location, sort of how I have it for stand to jump, but I haven't implemented that apparently. We talked about the body part updates here. This is sort of the reverse of the body part updates. We figure out how body parts have moved, and then we derive their velocities because they're not necessarily using the physics system. So we just calculate it based on how they've changed. We track the pawn and your hands separately. Sometimes you just want the hand velocity of the world, or just relative to the pawn, or whatever. So it's we have different velocities and different combinations here. This is where all the different collision sequences are. These are pretty complicated. Probably a lot of it you can fine tune, but will end up breaking. I recommend using caution when going into these, but I think they work fairly well. In fact, I think most of the fine tuning can be accomplished through either just changing variables or changing your environment around a little bit. I don't think too much needs to change in these functions, but I'll just go through and name them for you so that you're aware that they exist and where they are. Okay, so whenever your body runs into something, boom, that's there. When you're walking and your head runs into something, sometimes this is going to force you to crouch, basically. I demonstrated that in the demo video where I tried to stand up under the stairs, but it was too low. And so basically I couldn't get my head to go any higher. And then once I stepped back out from under the stairs, it popped me back up to my normal height. Sometimes your head will collide while you're floating, which is different from what it should do when you're walking. Match velocity. This is a thing so that if you are touching a wall with not very much velocity, that is to say you and your hand are not moving very fast, rather than push you away, it will match the velocity of it. So what will happen is if you're floating towards something and it's not moving and you're not moving very fast, if you reach out your hand slowly, the first thing that will happen is that you will slow down and come to a stop relative to the wall. If the wall happens to be moving, then it'll speed you up with it. So if the wall is rotating, for example, you'll begin to follow it without bouncing off the wall immediately. This, I think, pretty smoothly transitions into a push. Seated head push. I think this just keeps your head within certain bounds. If you're seated, there's an option for that. Foot collision push. I just did not think that that was a thing in, this must be when you're floating, that there's a foot collision. So here's foot collision bounce for when you come in too fast and you hit the floor. Foot collision push. I genuinely don't know what that does or what that might be for. Try getting rid of it, see what happens. Head collision bounce. This is when you're floating and your head hits. Okay, so I guess we have both a push and a bounce. Push just gives you like an actor offset and sort of declips you from the object, whereas a bounce actually accelerates you away from it. And we use both in different quantities to get good effects that feel natural. Okay, that's what we need to know about the body graph. Okay, we went over movement sequences, post-action body updates. I think we went over this also. Yep, this is updating all your body parts. Derived palm velocity we talked about. Great, so we're at replication. Let's go back and quickly talk about this network switcher thing. In here, we basically have two sets of branches. One is has authority. Is this running on a server? And the other one is this locally controlled? If you're using a dedicated server, these can never be true at the same time because the server doesn't have a pawn. But if we're using a listen server where the client is the server, well, he will have authority and he will have local control. So that'll go up through here. And so basically, you may find that there are different combinations of owner and authority that you want to target. In this case, we just have owner and copy. But you couldn't simply do this with a has authority switch because the listen server would always trigger owner, which is not what you want. You want the listen server to trigger copy if it's not his personal pawn. Okay, so what was this? This is scene capture for making it a little bit smoother. When I was recording the demo, I used this so that scene capture component moved sort interped behind my camera, so I wouldn't look so jerky. I have this disabled, but you can enable it if you want to do that, and then it'll set up on this page. It'll set up that to be on, and then it'll set your spectator screen to be the texture that that scene capture component is writing to. Right, not actually that important, just caught my attention. Okay, so here's the replication page. Client to server. All it's doing is grabbing a bunch of transforms, some of which are relative, and then it is sending them up to the server. And the server is taking those values and it's setting replicated variables. That's what these little balls mean. Anytime the server, because if you're owning client, we replicate it up to the server, and the server sets the variables, these are automatically replicated down to all clients. Now the trick here is you don't want the value that you just sent. You already know where you are. You don't need to hear back from the server about it, 100 milliseconds later. That'll just make you jerky and rubber band. So your own client never actually looks at these variables. We can see that on tick somewhere. Is that here? Yeah. So on tick, if you have a local copy, what that means is this is not your pawn. Because we got it from here, update local copy, meaning not you. You're not the owner of this. The computer this is currently running on is not the one controlling this pawn. It will take those values and it'll say, okay, I'll move them where the server told me that they are. But if it's yours, this never gets called because you control that with your local controls. Here is some item function replication. The reason that some of this goes through the pawn is that in order to bump a event up to the server, the actor that this is called from has to be owned from the computer that it's called from. And that's sometimes complicated to do. But I know that your pawn is always controlled by you, so I have the item shoot back to you and then bump this up to the server, and then sometimes the server will then go back to that item, and we'll talk about items later. I think that is mostly what we need to know about the pawn. If you look on the left side here, you can see these are the different event graphs. Start here. This shows you the basic order that things are happening in. I don't think you need to screw with these unless you see them. You might want to open them, but you won't need to peruse them. There are some interfaces that the pawn has. We'll talk about that later. Some macros that I also think you don't need to use or don't need to worry about unless you see them here. You want to know what it is. Well, then just double click it and you can, for instance, for a hand here, we have pick best quadrant. If you want to know what the heck is that, okay, well, that's what it does, but you don't need to peruse it, in my opinion. Now, something you may want to peruse, however, is the different variables. So, components are automatically, that's all these things, they're automatically dumped into the component variables. We save references to different framework things. So like if you want to talk to your player controller, input raw, meaning this is what the hardware says, whether or not it's valid or it means anything, it hasn't been decided yet. Derived input, meaning that we took the input raw and we matched it against the current state and other things and said, okay, this is the direction you're trying to go in, even though it's a function of several different inputs, right? Okay, things about the environment, these are mostly like temporary variables that for one reason or another need to be global. These are all things that you can change before you get started. Settings, state, just again, these need to be global variables in the pawn so that all the different functions know what the pawn is doing at the time. These are derived values that are, again, need to be global. Same thing with physics. And then these are mostly the ones that are unsorted or all have to do with replication. you can see that they're replicated here. Okay, we'll come back and we'll talk about the next section. Okay, we're now going to talk about items, which is the other major part of the template. Basically, we have the pawn and we have item interaction with the pawn. This is part of the template because item interaction is different in VR because you want to be able to use your hands. And it needs to happen naturally and give you feedback, etc., etc. So we go to the item interaction folder. I have this item folder within there for actual actors that are created items. And then the subcomponents which make them up are in this base folder here. So as an example, let's pop over to the Luna map, which is the map that you will hop into by default if you try to run the game. And here's an example of a couple items that we have. Here's the SMG. Here's the magazine. Okay, let's talk about how we made these things. So let's open this guy up. Let's put him here. Hop over to the viewport because most of it is going to happen from here. Okay, so whatever the basic thing is, make it the root, whatever the mesh needs to be. Set up your collision like so. Doesn't need hit events or overlap events. You can turn those off. But the important thing is that it's that the object type is item based. And then we want to turn all this stuff off. If we want item collision, that's going to be turned on in a separate spot. By default, we want them all off. Okay. And first thing we'll talk about is the SCL, which stands for subcomponent logic. You'll notice it has multiple SCLs because there are multiple subcomponents on this thing. But the main one is going to be directly attached to the main mesh. So your subcomponent logics get attached directly to the thing that they modify. You can see here is primary SCL is clicked. Yes. And then the big, the part where the real magic happens is in here. So we'll say something like they start rest. The state that any item starts in is at rest. Okay, the other states they could be in is held. Someone's holding it. Manipulated, meaning someone is touching it and moving it around, but it's not necessarily in their hand. The example I use here is the charging handle on the SMG. So you can't pick it up by the charging handle, but if you're already holding it, you can move around the charging handle. You can't grab it and throw it away, but you can move it, and I just call that being manipulated. And attached. So for example, the magazine, when the magazine gets attached into the SMG, that makes it attached, and that's the state it'll be. Right. A lot of these are variables that you don't need to worry about during the setup portion. I should hide them in some manner, but I haven't. Anyway, SCL functions by state is the important variable here. And you can go to add. Can't do it if it's default, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's that one. Yeah. So we'll change it back to that. So anyway, so assume we start from resting. So we added resting. So if the main item is at rest, no one's touching it or doing anything with it, what can happen to it? Well, it's going to depend who the person is. So we have relation. Here are the different relations. User, meaning the hand that is currently using this thing. If it's at rest, obviously the user doesn't exist, okay? Because if it was being used, it would be manipulated or it would be held. It wouldn't be at rest. The offhand, meaning if you're holding the SMG with your right hand, then your left hand is your offhand. And public is anyone not using it currently. And owner means either hand, meaning the owner of the main item, the primary SCL, whichever pawn that happens to be, either of his hands will count as the owner if they don't count as something else first. So anyway, so it's at rest. It's not doing anything, it's just sitting there, which means that the only relation it can have to someone is public. And so what kind of functions should be available to the public when it's at rest? Well, I want it to be able to be picked up. So we click that, and then we have some options here that we don't actually need to do. The important thing is, if it's at rest and you're a member of the public, you can pick it up. Okay, so let's say you've picked it up. Then what happens? Well, we can see that there are two. I've put in two here. One is for offhand and one is for user. Where user could say main hand or using hand. It doesn't refer to the pawn. It refers to the hand that's actually using this SCL. So the user can drop it. You're holding it. This is the hand that's holding it. You may drop it. And then in this case, I have it drop sticky. So what sticky means is that so if you pick something up, you're holding on the grip button and you release the grip button. If it's not sticky, you will drop the item. If it is sticky, you don't have to hold down the grip button. You just have to press it one more time if you want to throw it away. As if the item is sticky. You have to press. You have to do an additional action to drop it. This is because in some games, maybe you don't want to have to hold down the grip button the whole time. Maybe you're gonna have that gun for most of the game, and it would be stupid to make your player hold that down. It would be annoying for him. So we make it sticky. Now this offhand, why do we have offhand pickup? Well, I want you to be able to switch hands for your SMG. If you want to put it in your left, if you had it in your right hand, you want to put it in your left hand. Now I have it on prox only, meaning that you shouldn't be able to teleport it to your left hand if your left hand is, if you have your arms spread wide, like Tonga, whatever that TNG reference is. You have to go put your hand basically onto the SMG, and then it'll highlight, and you can pick it up, and then that offhand will become the using hand. Important note on this particular one, I have a special option. Let me see, state options. Yeah, is it when it's held, meaning it's no longer resting, someone is holding it. I have Alt VisBox enabled. So what that does is this now becomes the box responsible for interacting with the item. So if you're not holding it, this whole box here, you just have to move your hand in proximity to it, and this box will light up, and you can press the grip button and you'll grab it. Now once you're already grabbing it, it would be annoying if this remained the box, because you're going to want to do things like put a magazine in the magazine. Well, you're going to want to grab the charging handle, you're going to want to grab the foregrip. You don't want to be accidentally moving the gun between left and right hand every time you do that. So what happens is, when it detects that it's in state held, it switches from this box to the Alt Vis box, which is attached to the SCL. And then, so you can put your hands over here, and it won't say, "Oh, you're trying to grab me." It'll say, "Oh, you're trying to grab whatever's over here." Hope that makes sense. If that didn't make sense, come talk to me. You can do other things. But before we get to that, let's talk about two more custom subcomponents. So we talked about the SCL itself, we talked about the Alt Vis box. Let's talk about hand aids. So hands are complicated to get them right where you want them. So I just made a custom left and a custom right component. You attach them directly to the item. And so when you pick up this item, rather than the hand just attaching to the pivot of the item, wherever the 0 origin is for the transform, we say, okay, this is what I want it to look like if you're holding it with the right hand. This is for the left hand. This is how it should be positioned. And you can, at this time, I don't have it, but in the future, there's no reason you couldn't set it up to say, and this is the pose I want the hand to be. And you could send an animation to the hand and say, this is what it should look like when I'm grabbing it. Okay, so that was hand aids that are attached to the thing. The SCL will automatically detect these. We talked about the Alt Vis box so that you're not grabbing the gun when you're trying to grab the charging handle. And then the next big one is called the item coordinator. Every item, and when I say item, I mean interactable item that you want to be able to pick up and do stuff with your hands. We're just calling items. Needs a coordinator. And this helps coordinate between the different SCLs, and it helps do things like it keeps track of who the owner is of the whole thing. So like the it notices who's holding the primary SCL, and it'll say, okay, this is the owner of me. His other hand counts as the offhand. You have special privileges with respect to this actor now. It's also going to detect when the thing is dropped, and it's going to say, okay, do we do physics? Lock physics. That's not what. Is that physics on drop? Yeah. And so it'll say, okay, we're gonna drop. Or if any of the SCLs need to talk to each other, for example, the foregrips, they need to know the foregrip and the rear grip need to know where each other are relative to each other, and they do that just by talking to the item coordinator. Um, this will make sense as you do it. Okay, so we talked about all the different custom subcomponents and how they're used for the main item here. Let's talk about some of the other ones. So for example, we have another subcomponent on the magwell. And what this does is it basically just acts as an attaching point for the magazine. And let's see, does it SCL functions by state? It doesn't have any, because basically I don't need it to interact with any hands. What I need it to do is we pop down to attach info and we say, okay, this basically exists to receive the magazine. And we have some options here, like needs held means the primary thing needs to be held. You can't insert the magazine if if someone's not holding the rifle. Stuff like that. You can tell it. I think we didn't do that. I want to say we didn't do that either. But valid targets and invalid targets. So say, okay, anything that's a rifle mag, I will accept. Anything that's a pistol mag, I will not accept. Oh, it does. So this is basically the types that it wants, types it doesn't want, and the types that it is. So it's calling itself rifle. It wants a rifle mag. It doesn't want pistol mags. Let's just pop over to the magazine real quick. And we can see that its SCL is set up like so. See, this one, despite being an attaching thing, does need to be picked up. So it's got different functions SCL. If it's resting, anyone in the public can pick it up. Okay, great. If you're held, the user can drop it. And the user can pick it up with their other hand. If it's attached, then only the owner, meaning whoever owns the primary SCL of the actor it's attached to, can pick it up again. And we can see in its attachment info, it's male, it attaches to female. We have check on drop, meaning if you try to drop the thing, it'll check. It won't yank it out of your hand, for example. I don't remember how many of these options are actually implemented, but I can talk to you briefly about different ways you might want to do it. So you might want to have it so that anytime it comes into contact with the female attachment SCL, and the types are valid, they work together. That even if you're holding it, it'll rip itself out of your hand and just shove itself into the magwell. You might find that to be convenient for some reason, or you might say, okay, don't actually do that. When I want it to go into something, I will drop it, and then it'll check, and it'll either fall into the floor or it'll attach itself to wherever. And it needs held in this context. I don't remember what it does, but you can imagine just different settings for, does the thing I'm putting it into need to be held? Can I be attached to something if I'm not currently held? Like, could you slam the gun down on top of the magazine? I guess in real life, if you were, had really good hand-eye coordination, that would be possible. But I think in this case, I said no. If you do that, just let them bounce off each other. This needs to be held in order to be inserted. And I think this probably tells it both check all the time and check on drop or something. We'll go into the targets trace we're not implementing here. I don't think. No, I think I used it in the previous iteration. So it can see, oh, okay, I want to be inserted into a rifle. I don't want to be inserted into a pistol. I am a rifle mag. So it's looking for these things. The female attach is looking for these things, and we're just making sure that the targets are valid and that none of them are invalid. Okay, that's how attachment works. Great. And then we have, on either of these, we have these attachment references. I want to say that we put tags in there. We did indeed. So this is a lot like the hand aids, these attachment refs. Just helps you get everything lined up perfectly. So you actually need to write in there @ref m, and in this one we have @ref f, so that the mail will line itself up with this at that point. So you don't need to worry about like where is the pivot for this guy and what's the central transform for this SEL. Say no, just have line up their references. Okay, that's how that works. Handle mesh. So you can't see them because it's under the hands right now, but there's a charging handle in there. And then you can grab it with either side with these hand aids you see. Is that this? Yeah. So we'll see here that when it's resting, that means it's not being manipulated. Only the owner can grab it, and it has to be from close in. You can't like use force grab on the charging handle. You need to move your hand to it and grab it. And then after it is being manipulated, the user, the thing that's currently manipulating it, may release it. Release is like drop for manipulate. So we have pick up and drop, manipulate and release, and either of those can be sticky. And then that'll let you move it around. Now, how do we determine how far you can move it around? Well, with this cute little manipulation constraint, which is just another custom component, which I forgot to mention as I was going over all the custom components. You attach that to the SEL, which it should be constraining. And I want to say this will automatically attach itself to the primary, or else it wouldn't really make sense. But anyway, you just screw with this location and its scale. In this case, its location is right here in its scale. I'll make this a little bigger so you can actually see it. Telling it you can move it anywhere within this box. Now the reason I have these set to 0 is because I actually just want it to move on a line. I don't want it to move left, right, or up and down. I just want it to be able to move from here to here. And that's what that box represents. And when you grab it, it looks for this manipulation constraint and says, okay, I will move myself to the closest point to your motion controller that is within this manipulation constraint. And then the prox check, which if you'll remember, I did not implement yet, but is on the hand page in the pawn, will say, okay, if your motion controller gets too far away from this silly thing, we're just disconnecting you. All right, and the last part is the foregrip. So we got a little angled foregrip in here that you can kind of see when I clip through all of these guys. I have hand aids to show how it works, how your hand should be attached to it when you grab it. If we look at the SEL, we'll go through and we'll say, okay, there's really only two. When I'm resting, it means I'm not being manipulated. My owner, meaning the guy that's holding me, he can use his other hand or whatever to hold on to me. And if I'm being held on to, I'm being manipulated, then the thing that's manipulating me can let go of me. Pretty easy. I think there's, so all we have to do is check is foregrip. And I think on this rear one we have is rear grip. Yep, that's right. These guys will find each other. If you have one foregrip and one rear grip, they will find each other through the item coordinator. And then once you pick it up, if you are holding, if you're holding the item, you're holding it by the rear grip with one hand, and then if you grab it by the foregrip with your other hand, it'll use special aiming rules that I think are good and not bad. Okay, that is how you set up items. So I encourage you to go ahead and look inside of the subcomponent logic. You can see how it's doing the things that it does. the main thing is that it's got these interfaces. You go over to class settings, interface subcomponent, so it'll have this automatically. And this is what allows it to communicate with things in an easy way. Anyway, through that interface, whenever you receive messages from the pawn, this is where it's communicating with the pawn. These are the two important things to look at. If you think you've got everything set up correctly, but the pawn's not talking to it right, look here. The other function to look at is the do function. I need desperately to go in and comment this and clean it up. Basically, anytime it receives what it considers a valid request, so it checks whether or not the request is valid somewhere else, then it goes through here and it executes the request, sets all the variables, does all the side effects, and then reports itself back to the item coordinator. Now let's look at, so I skipped over that pretty quickly. This is pretty complicated, especially as it has to do with replication. It's a little bit advanced. I personally would have to go in and look whenever if I need to change it. I need to go figure out how it works myself. But it does work, as you can see in the demo. And so if you've got the time to actually go in and say, wait, what is actually happening when I call this pickup function? Oh, maybe these two things, maybe this needs to happen first, or something like that. It's complicated. There's a lot of back and forth between the hand, the item, the coordinator, and then that's also has to happen on the server and it needs to be multicast. So to go over it would be very tedious for me, so I don't want to. Just know that those are the places to look. Of note, we'll go back and we'll look again. I'll give you sort of the same advice on the coordinator. Coordinator is not as complicated, but this is where all the coordination stuff happens. The important bit here is these three. It's going to, whenever an SDL changes state, it's going to report that fact here. So this is a good place to put in trigger hooks. Whenever it's picked up or dropped, this is, aside from the SDL doing its own little logic, it calls the coordinator and it says, hey, I was the primary SDL and I got dropped, so do what you need to do. And in this case, that means do physics. Additionally, so in addition to this report state change, we can get from the item, if the item has the, what's the interface called? Interface interactable item. It can receive, it actually needs this. So one of the things you need to do manually, and I wish I could have figured out a way for this to happen automatically, is the return chord. I have to have you put in this function, set up the chord. So basically, set the coordinator, let everything know who the coordinator is, and then whenever people ask for it, they can just get it right here. This is the one thing you can't just add through here. I'm upset about it, and maybe one day I'll figure out a better way to do it. Okay, back to what I was talking about. Anytime I think we have a state change, the SEL will shoot it up here. And so this is the spot where you might want to say, okay, if maybe you want to switch because you want multiple things. We'll say if it's the main SEL here, and and you get picked up, maybe it needs to do something special here. Or we can put in here a name, which means you can put in any kind of custom thing. So if we wanted a function like you're held and the user can drop you, but let's also say that the user can press the trigger. Okay. We'll say shoot. So if we get from him, let's not worry about, well, yeah, it should have to be held. That's redundant, but I guess it doesn't hurt. Switch on name. Okay, and so that's how you would catch the fact that the user sent a trigger command to this SCL. It gets reported up here, and it sends, and you can send a little custom message. Tell it, hey, do this, whatever. Let's talk about buttons, which are a little bit complicated. We're going to open up this actor, which just holds a plain, some letters, and the button itself. That looks like this. The button is a custom component. There's a lot of complicated stuff going on in here. Some of it controls movement, some of it controls appearance, and then the interesting part is controls, well, what does it actually do when you press it? And we'll talk about how to get that set up. So this button component, it knows how to be pressed and change colors and all that sort of stuff. You can figure out how to make the colors change the way you want them to, but the act of pressing the button and seeing it move and bounce back to where it's supposed to go, that happens automatically. Now, if you needed to do a particular thing, there are a number of ways to do that. I'm going to talk about just two, I think. Looking over at some of the default variables here, we have target input. And so this is going to help us figure out which actor holds the function that we want to trigger when this button is pressed. So we look at target method and we have some options here. Own actor, using pawn, unique nick, direct name, manual set. I'm going to talk about just using own actor because it's fairly simple just to make it live in this actor here. But there's methods through the routing singleton to find just the nickname of a actor. If you can give it a unique nickname, it'll talk to the routing singleton just like the SCLs talk to the item coordinator. There's a single router in the game where buttons and functions can find each other. You can type in the actual name, like the what the game thinks the name is. Manual set, I think this makes it happen in game, not at this point. And then sometimes if you have a unique function, it'll figure out which actor has that. The ones you're going to want to use the most are either own actor or using pawn. So maybe you want to call a function within the pawn that pressed it. In this case, though, we're going with own actor. Now you'll notice that we didn't put anything for function name, didn't put anything for target name. These are the things that would have helped us. So for instance, if we wanted to look up by function name, we would have typed in a function name. If we wanted to use a unique target, we would put that there. But we're doing own actor. Okay, so let's get rid of that for now. Next is we're going to talk about what kind of button it is. Toggle, once, repeat, and quick. And then quick is actually a type of once that just doesn't go through the router. So toggle means you press it once, it's on, you press it again, it's off. Once means that you can press it and it'll fire the event. Repeat means you can press and hold it and it'll continuously fire the event for as long as you're holding it and then stop when you release it. And quick is a special type that is just a once that doesn't go through the router. And I think that's what we're using here. So if it were a repeater, you'd put the frequency in here, and you can put the label for the button here, what it says on it. The stuff is set inside. So if we are targeting manually, we can tell it, we might either set it by the actor or by a scene. And it'll figure out its ID from the router. If we're looking for, again, which actor holds the function that we want to target. In our case, it's own actor, so this is going to get bypassed. We know which actor it is. It's this one. But which function is it going to use? Well, because we're using a quick, we need to type in the function manually. So anyway, you can just literally copy and paste this. Once you add this interface, add a remote target helper to your actor, you just need to make sure that you return a reference to it and your target ID for here, which will help you later. Okay, so anyway, you are a target for remote functions. So I have some setup that you need to do. So this actor only has one function that can be called on it. And we basically we talk to this guy and we tell it, hey, my name, if I had a unique name, if a button wanted to find me by unique name, is this. And these are the functions that I hold. And this is their name, this is their default status, and this is their type. The fact that it's quick means that it's not going through the router, it's going directly to this actor. And I'll show you where we see that. So if we're going through the router, what'll happen whenever, after everything's set up, is that the router will tell me when I'm being called. It says, hey, a button with your function got pressed. Here's the function, and here's who sent it. And then I'll say, okay, maybe I'll trigger it or whatever. And then I'll tell the router, okay, I'm on right now, or I'm no longer available, or something. However, if it's quick, then the way we get it is just through here. We don't talk to the router. We don't update statuses or anything. We assume that it works, and if it doesn't work, the button does not get feedback about it. So it's just, hey, you're my target actor. This is the name of the function. If you happen to have a switch with that function name on it, execute whatever that is. Okay, so they're kind of similar. This just relieves you of having to deal with the router, which is not really that bad, but if you need to troubleshoot it, I imagine it will be. Okay, I'm going to move into the button component and sort of show you where all that setup happens. Now all the movement and everything else, blah, 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 is in here. The replication is down here. But to me, the interesting portion, the part where you're going to get bugs, is down here during the setup, where the first thing it's going to do, and it's going to say, how am I finding my target? If it's the own actor, it'll look and it'll see if it's got the interface set up correctly. If it doesn't, it'll tell you about it. It'll tell you what the actor's ID is as far as the router is concerned. And then it'll either say target found or target not found. And if you have own actor set up and it doesn't manage to find it, well, that's an issue. You need to go back and you change the way the actor is set up. These three I apparently haven't done, but you can imagine how they're done. Unique target NIC, it'll go with the router. If you have a unique NIC, if the target actor does it and it registered it with the router, it'll say, hey router, I think my target's name is whatever, and it'll come back and say, okay, here's the ID. You can set it manually. This I think you want to happen at runtime. I don't think there's any reason to do that before, right? Right. Okay, so we found the actor, hopefully. Then we want to find the function. Um, if it's through the router, we'll see, okay, this is the function name we thought, and then we think this is our target actor ID. Does that actor have a function called that? And either yes it does, great, that's our function, or no it doesn't. And it will say, wait a second, are we trying to set up are we trying to do the function quick, do a quick, therefore do a manual setup, manual function name. And then it'll say, oh, yes we are. It'll say, fine, I'm not checking it though. Like it doesn't go in and make sure that the actor actually has that function, and it won't check even if it does have it, it won't check if that function is available. But it'll say, okay, fine, I trust that you know what you're doing because this is type quick. And if it wasn't type quick, if it was type with the router, we'll subscribe to the updates and we'll tell the router, hey, just FYI, I'm a button who is interested in this target function. So if this function no longer becomes available, let me know about it so I can turn red or something. Or whatever. Okay. I think everything else, despite looking the way it looks, is considerably less complicated. I will just show where the two routes for, so when a button is pressed, it's moving blah, blah, blah. And then here, it either, if it's going through the router, it'll check with its last subscription to see if it's still available. And then so locally, if it thinks it's available, it'll give you a provisional yes, this has worked, before checking with the server and checking with the actual target function to make sure it works. So it actually checks twice, once locally and once with the server on the router, if you go through the router. But if it's quick, it's just like, okay, button pressed. Yep, and I wrote that in here. This is not actually untested. That's no longer true. In fact, I think this is the only thing tested in multiplayer. Did I test this? In fact, I think they're both tested. We'll see what happens. Anyway, either goes down to quick, where again it fires this function, which looks like this, or it does its local check, it tries it, and it tries it through the router, and then the router says either yes or no, and then the router pushes it to the target actor and says, all right, go ahead and call that function. And then the router knows about that function because it would have been set up over here, except it wouldn't have been set up as quick. It would have been set up as a once repeater toggle. Okay, that's how buttons work. That was a little bit complicated. I don't know if we talked about remote target helper. That's just the thing that the actor that holds a function that a button might target. That's a custom subcomponent that it'll hold, and then this will act as the liaison between itself and the router, and the router will talk to the button. So you can have some layers of abstraction between your button and the target actor where the function is called, or not, or you can just use ownActor in combination with quick to just say, you know what, screw it, I know what I want, and I don't need you to check it. But you can imagine, some circumstances where, we're changing around what the buttons do a lot. I want to display to the user through the color of the button whether or not this function is available, whether or not it actually triggered when you press the button. So you got options. All right, that's buttons. Talked a little bit about how some of the pawn replication happens and some of the item replication. But let's talk about how multiplayer actually gets set up. So for here, we're going to go to the enter map. And the enter map is going to be the default map, and we know this because we go to project settings, maps and modes, and we can see that the editor starts at base map, which is just a blank map, so that you can recover from crashes more easily. And the default map is the enter map. So what's here? Well, nothing really. It's just like a default map. Why do we do this? Well, let's open up the level blueprint. Sorry, this is a little bit messy. But what this does is, and it tells you, as soon as you start the game, it'll say looking for LAN sessions, and indeed it will look for sessions, and it'll wait for 5 seconds and it'll say, did I find any sessions? And if it has not, then it'll create a session and it'll open up that other map that we just came from, and anyone who's on your local area network will be able to join your listen server that you've just created. If it did find a session, it'll say, great, we're going to join it. And unless it doesn't work, in which case it'll say, sorry, we failed. So what's the takeaway here is that how do I quickly test multiplayer? Well, have one person start, wait 7-8 seconds for the server to be created. Once you'll know that the server is created once that map opens, and then have your clients just open and it'll join automatically. Now, if that's not working for whatever reason, well, check to make sure that you've got the right ports open on your router. Make sure you're actually on the right LAN. And if all else fails, you can actually execute a console command by hitting the tilde key. This is what it looks like if it was a blueprint, but if it's, you can do this from within game. You hit that key, it'll bring up a console within the game. It'll be difficult in VR and much more difficult if you're on standalone VR. But in PC VR, not so bad because you got a keyboard, and you type open and then whatever the IP address is. Or whatever, probably won't be that. And then just hit enter, and it will try to connect to that IP address if it's got an Unreal game going on. Okay, and maybe I typed that too small. Anyway, what that command was open, space, and the IP address, and that's all. And that will, instead of trying to open a map, will try to connect to a server. Okay, I hope this orientation has been helpful. I don't have the time to go through every single function and explain how they work. I don't even have the time to go in and remind myself how they all work. I sort of do it as I go because it's complicated and I suck at writing documentation apparently, or suck at even trying to write documentation. But you should now know what functions exist and where they are, which should give you a big head start into getting things running. And again, I'm pretty much always available in Discord. I'm pretty willing to just drop what I'm doing and help people when they ask questions. You can hop in and verify that for yourself just by looking through the chat history there. I'll put a link to the Discord in the video description. Anyway, you may want to subscribe if you want to, just so that you know when I put out new videos. I don't know if I'm putting out any more videos, but if I do more in-depth tutorials, they'll be here and you'll know about them if you subscribe, or if you're just in the Discord, I'll post them there. Either way works for me. Okay, good luck. I hope everything works out for you.